Thank you for your time. My name is Betula, and this is Bet on It, Shooting from the Hip. I appreciate you being here. Please keep in mind what we are doing here on Bet on It, Shooting from the Hip. We explore human ideas, philosophies, and noteworthy information. This exploration is us thinking aloud, a thought exercise, jumping into ideas and examining them and re-examining them. You will find we're prone to using adult language and expressing opinions. In keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything we say. We are not experts of any kind. We are just having fun with these ideas, philosophies, and information. In the hopes that you will find it fun and interesting and entertaining, we encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now on with the shit show. Slim, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Excellent. So today's episode is a super interesting story about a rivalry between two historically important martial artists. Actually, they're karateka or karate martial artists. And their story really does relate to things that we often discuss with regards to your personal subjective experience of reality and objectivity. So we're gonna get into these two interesting individuals, their historical significance, and then what went on with the rivalry, and then we'll start looking at it in terms of like their subjective views versus their subjective views and subjective behaviors versus objectivity and how they could have behaved in an objective way. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this feud, but the feud was between Motobu, Choki, and Gichin Funakoshi. Okay, so those are the two men's names. Their significance, we'll cover the feud, and then we'll get into some of the details of each of them, because their experiences kind of molded what they ended up doing, and then that in turn kind of what allowed for them to have an intersection that led to a feud. So they had very little in common, especially in terms of like the way that they were raised, even though they were both Okinawan. So Okinawa is a small island, part of the Ryukyu Kingdom, that's off the mainland Japan, right? So that's kind of important. So Okinawa is considered the birthplace of karate, and it's got a rich history, which we're not going to get into because it's just, again, too involved. But Motobu Choki was born in 1870 and he died in 1944, and he was considered one of the best karate fighters of his era, right? This guy was super, super fascinating in terms of like what the kind of things he did. He would, under a pressure test, he would go into the red light district, so that would be where you would find all the clubs and illegal gambling, prostitution, and he would go down there and pick fights. So he put what he had learned, and both of them had been training since childhood. He would put it to a test, right? So he was constantly approaching his subjective way of presenting his view of martial arts was as it related to combat. So that means you had to seek out combatants. You had to have fights, right? So that was his kind of approach, right? And Funakoshi Gichin, he was born in 1868 and died in 1957, and he's the founder of Shotokan Karate, which is probably the most popular form of karate on the planet now, right? And which is the most widely known school or style of karate. as he's referred to as the father of modern karate. All right, so already you can see where this might be going, right?
Yeah, I can see that they might want to fight to show their styles better. Maybe it's like a class issue. Maybe it's an issue where one was in the red light district, one of them came over to test out something.
Well, again, the story's way more interesting, and then the way that they present, then you'll see that, like, as much as the idea that karate's about creating a foundation of like sound individuals, you'll recognize very quickly that these guys are, mature headmasters, and they're not they're not behaving in a way that you could characterize as being sound. But we'll get into the details of that in a moment. But like I said, it adds layers to this story, and that's why we're talking about it, right? So Gichin Funakoshi was well educated, and he was fluent, and like there's in Okinawa they speak a their form of Japanese is different than mainland Japanese, so you can so there can be difficulty in communication unless you actually know how the difference is, right? So anyway, his philosophy was that in karate the individual could transcend the egotistical self, and the student of karate could render the mind empty of selfishness and wickedness in the effort to act appropriately, right? He looked at it as a way of life. He's the first expert to introduce karate-do to the mainland Japan in 1916. And he was of samurai lineage, and a family which had been vassals for the Roikyu dynasty. So the Okinawans, their kingdom was the Roikyu kingdom, right? So at age 11, I made a name for himself in the Roikyu style of martial arts. So he took some of the earliest forms of karate, or like Shorin-ryu and Shorin-rei-ryu. These are the earliest iterations of karate, and he was educated in those. And plus he had a proper, scholastic education, right? He became the chairman of the Okinawan Martial Arts Society, instructor of the Okinawan Teachers School in 1922. 54, he introduced Okinawan Karate Jiu-Jitsu as the first minister of education to mainland Japan. So his contribution was he integrated it into the university systems, right, into the educational system. So it became part of that, right? And again, expressly because of what it would allow, what it could do potentially for individual students because of its philosophy, right? So he sponsored a physical education exhibition and an introduction of the first ever public display of karate jiu-jitsu in Japan. A great success. Previously unknown martial artist, Gichin Funakoshi rose to instant fame throughout the Japanese world of martial arts. So everybody knew who he was as a result of him integrating into mainland Japan and becoming an educator, and then using this as the basic tenets or philosophy of karate to get wider exposure, get it into the educational systems. He trained in both styles of the Okinawan karate of the time, which was Shori-ryu and Shorin-ryu, right? I hope I'm saying all that right. He combined both to create the system of karate now that's the most commonly known throughout the world, which is Shotokan. And Funakoshi's pen name was Shoto. So anytime he wrote anything, he would just write, like when he signed a signature, it would be Shoto, which means waving pines. And kan means training hall or house. So Shotokan referred to the house of Shoto. So it was his training system, right? It was his methodology, which was an integration of the two systems that he was educated in, which were the foundational karate systems in Okinawa. All right, sorry, that's a lot of information, but this stuff's important, particularly once we get to Motobu. When we get to him, you're gonna find him the complete opposite of this dude. But anyway, so and here's the thing that makes the real distinction for Gichin Funakoshi. His idea was that it was all about the elevation of the individual, but not to use the methodology in application in terms like sports sparring or any kind of fighting. That those were things he just didn't do, and he emphasized kata, right? And kata is like a codified system of connected movements that are of a martial capacity, right? So for anybody who doesn't know what kata is, it's that martial dance that you see them do if you've ever watched anyone on television or the internet, right? So he was against the use of like sparring as a training tool. And the funny thing is that it's actually a fantastic training tool, but not in the way that most people imagine. I will comment on that in a bit too. But his son, Gigo Funakoshi, once he assumed control of Shotokan karate, his emphasis was an equal commitment to combat elements of the martial arts and the kata elements and the ideas of like an elevated individual. So he did what most people do or favor to do. To me, that's the most balanced way to approach it, right? So anyway, we'll get more to it in a moment. And Gichin Funakoshi's one of his famous quotes is that a statement he made was that the ultimate aim of karate lies not in victory or defeat, but in the perfection of the character of its participants. Right? So he was completely on board. His idea was that this was about essentially elevation of the individual, right? And all the practical stuff was non-essential. To me, I'm like going, it's like you took a divot out of the hole. It's incomplete now, your system. And what more proof do you want that his son, who became the head of Shotokan karate, one of the first things he did was integrate sparring and practical application. Like that became an important part of his approach. And you see Shotokan karate today, they have wild tournaments and stuff. Well, at least they used to. But anyway, so we'll get on to, so that kind of sums up Gichin Funakoshi, so you can wrap your head around where he was at. Here's the interesting thing about him that I didn't read in the note package, is that he was a sickly child. So his family's investing him the effort into training in karate actually allowed for him to develop a more robust health. So he's coming from that, thinking that it can elevate you. You can be like, you can make yourself something more than what you imagine yourself to be. And this is just a way to do it, right? And I advocate for the martial arts all the time. I think everybody should be doing them, but that's just me. So Motobu Choki was born to a branch of the Roikyu royal family. So he was, I think his grandfather was like the sixth sibling of the king of the Roikyu kingdom before it got dissolved, right? So who's literally like royalty, like, flag waving, yeah. Right? But he was the neglected child because he was the third child. So all the benefits, and within their tradition, all the benefits would go to the firstborn son, right? And he was given as a firstborn son, access to the best of everything. But because Motobu was the third son, basically he's the one who made it. But from childhood, made karate study the single pursuit of his life, because he had to distinguish himself, because he wasn't going to get any handouts, right, from the family. So he finally left Okinawa in 1921. He was 51, And the time he left Okinawa, he was well known as the strongest karate fighter, largely unknown though in Japan. And you know, and karate now is like is taking the nation. Everybody's doing karate. Everybody was kung fu fighting. No,
So they're both from Okinawa, right?
that's right.
Moto is from an off branch of the main family
The
of Okinawa.
yeah, the actual royal family.
So I'm seeing like a huge difference between the two. There's one that was sickly, had lots of benefits, grew up with us with the Ryukun.
Yeah, but he came from like he had samurai lineage in his family. He came from a family that were well to do, so
Yeah.
so he got all the benefits. Now, as the son of royalty, they basically the guy that they got to train Motobu was the guy that introduced those original foundational karate systems in Okinawa. He kind of tried to get it into the educational system there. So they got him to directly train their children. So that included the first son that had all the advantages. And allegedly, the story is that as they were growing up, the oldest brother would beat the shit out of him all the time, right?
I'm seeing two characters. One's a lot of clean edge, spiritual. The purpose of martial arts is self enlightenment, and then the one's like, I'm gonna beat you up to show you I can.
So then he was still trained with his brother and the teacher they would bring, but he sought out other karate masters in Okinawa because he wanted essentially to beat his brother, right? And so by the time he was 20, there was nobody who was beating him up anymore, right? So anyway, so so he was hoping that like on mainland Japan, Motobu was hoping that he could get like some real success and um and and experience some of the benefits of that kind of success, because Okinawa is actually a poor prefecture. There's not a lot of opportunity there, but mainland Japan, tons of it, right? So, like I said, so he moved to Osaka in 1921. So for the first year he was there, he really struggled to try and get some kind of notoriety, and so then he agreed to uh, a demonstration fight with an not an American, a Western boxer, so a pugilist, like somebody, and I think they're Western European, they weren't American. I couldn't get there, I couldn't find a name, right? But anyway, and so at that time, Motobu was 52, and he trounced this dude. Like, so and as a result of that, he became an instant household name in Japan for his fighting skills, right? So then he moves to Tokyo in 1927. Funakoshi already been there for several years and established a name for himself and had a large number of students. So in his move, he's got nothing. You know, that means he's arriving to Tokyo without anything. So there's a way for martial artists to try and draw more attention to themselves, considering that he already, you know, his exploits with this Western boxer making him like instant popularity, right? So he stayed in Japan for 20 years to teach karate, but due to the escalation of the war, he had to close his dojo and return to Okinawa in 1941. Now, but in that time, he does have the rivalry, and he does struggle because he speaks Okinawan, and him trying to speak Japanese, uh, it was difficult for him to speak Japanese. So it was hard. He was hard to understand, and because he stripped down. Remember, both of them, Gichin Funakoshi integrated two different systems of karate to produce Shotokan. Motobu's system was basically stripped away everything except for the practical fighting stuff. So teaching his stuff there wasn't a huge body of knowledge to pass on. It was just is basically here. This is the practice, and now we fight, right?
Yeah, that seems extremely practical. It's like, okay, this is how you fight. You hit him, and then you hit him again.
Yeah. So and he applied karate as a combat skill through rigorous practical testing in street fights in red light districts. He liked doing that, but there's some that allege the reason why he kept doing that was he would place bets on himself. Because part of going into the red light districts, you could have illegal fights, and then everybody's gambling on the outcome of the fight, and he would always bet on himself. So
That seems like a good business practice if you know what you're doing.
well, I mean, clearly it worked, right? Because it was something that he did ongoing. So once he tapped into it, he realized it was a way to make money, but it's illegitimate money, right? And it doesn't contribute to any kind of legitimacy of what he's trying to do, which is to, open up schools and have students, right? To become successful in that capacity, right? So his system of karate is Motobu karate, right? And so this, I think this quote from him will say it all. Like you'll suddenly realize who we're talking about. And it goes like this: nothing is more harmful to the world than a martial art that is not effective in actual self-defense, right? And he made that as a public statement.
Yeah, that's a bold statement to make in Japan,
Right.
like
So,
1950s.
well, this was actually the 20s, right? The 30s. This is the real heyday. It's all prior to World War II, right? So, Japan's very industrialized at that time. You don't have people walking around with swords at their waists anymore. It's a very modern place to be, right?
Yeah, but there's still like the clashing of the traditional values there at that time.
Yeah, but I think they've always been trying to integrate their old thinking and kind of this industrialization kind of worldview, right? So I think they're very successful at it. So I don't think anybody would sit there and go that somehow it was, that they weren't successful at integrating the two. I think they've managed to do it just fine. But this is early in the heyday. Now we're gonna go before we get to the rivalry. I want to talk about dojo storming, right? So. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but I'm going to just give it my best shot. So it's dojo aburi, which translates as dojo storming, also known as dojo arashi, right? It's the action of visiting a rival martial arts school in order to challenge its members. So this form of challenge, it was how masters would try and compete for students because they had a limited number of students, right? And that's what makes a school successful, is collecting tuition. So what they would do is sometimes you would have a headmaster show up at another school and challenge the headmaster there. But the protocol was that, because they had this way of doing it, that the challenger would have to go through all the ranks. So the belt ranking system, which was Gichin Funakoshi and Jigaro Kano, they were close friends. And he's the one who created the colored belt system. So when you would storm a dojo, you'd show up, you're a black belt, you'd have to go through a white belt, a yellow belt, a green belt, orange belt, whatever the colors were. And then the last person that you would fight, the boss fight, would be the black belt master of the school. So the idea was that if they could put on a significant display of their skills, that they could, that the students of that school that they challenged, they might go to his school, to the challenger school, to learn from the challenger, right? So they were all competing for dues. So you can see now why Chotobu would go to the red light district. And it was just a way to, again, to kind of like, put money in the pocket, be able to, have access all to all the material stuff that you need in the course of living your life, and it was just a workaround, right? So
that's a great way to do street vending. Just beating somebody up and going like, check that out. Hey, come to my dojo.
Well, they would do public. So part of the history of martial arts is they would put on public displays, and then somebody would walk around with a hat and collect coins and stuff like that, right? So it was another way of generating revenue, was by putting on a display. That's why katas were really good for that. It was a single person fight, and if somebody's can do it in such a way where it's done in a way that you could describe as being fast and powerful and energetic. It's kind of mildly entertaining, right? So all of this leading up to the rivalry is all part of the culture of that early karate culture. And I'll tell you, the only reason I know this stuff is because how not only am I fascinated by it, but I love the idea of it. I really do. Like, I'm enamored with it. I think it's kind of brutal and weird, but it's still so cool that they were doing shit like this, right? You don't do anything like that now. And I dare say in North America, they probably never did it. I'm not aware of even in the 60s and 70s, when it was the Wild West of the martial arts, that I don't think that they ever did stuff like that. I think you had headmasters and senior students challenge each other to fights and stuff like that, but that was more to determine who was better. But it had nothing to do with, like, it wasn't so formal like in dojo storming, which it's the formality of it that you show up and you challenge the school. It's basically the kind of stuff you see in a Bruce Lee movie.
Yeah, because like being the master alone is impressive, but going step by step to slowly show them, like, I'm
coming after you, man. I'm gonna get rid of these guys. I'm gonna get you. But that means that the most senior student, which would probably be a black belt, would be a really tough challenge for the fighter. Oh, yeah. So it makes you wonder if they ever made it to the headmaster of the school. I'm sure that some did.
Did they fight continuously during that day, or is it like...
No, you just show up and you present. You go, I'm challenging, and then somebody responds to the challenge, and then you have an exchange until you knock them down, and then you move on to who's next.
Yeah, so no wait time.
Yeah, like it's on. We're doing it right now.
I've heard of the tradition of breaking the signs of the masters who lost, like some way of like disbanding their opponent's dojo if they won.
I guess that kind of relates to the dojo storming, but see, I can only imagine that even in the course of people doing it, showing up and challenging any school like a challenger, all sorts of stuff that doesn't make it into the history books, like that you would only see if you were there, where they would do stuff like that. Maybe they destroy some of the interior. It's not enough they beat up the students working their way to the headmaster. You smash, like, because if you got, especially currently and conventionally, most schools will have pictures of the founder and other notable people within their dojo and stuff like that. So you could see where that would make easy targets for a guy trying to dominate, but it's a total dick move, right? But like,
yeah, I thought it was tradition because I've seen the trope in some movies.
Yeah, no, I think that's more a movie thing, okay. Right? So, but in terms of like the dojo storming itself, like, it was a regular occurrence. And now remember, we're talking about the 20s and the very early 30s, late 1920s and early 1930s, when this is going on. This is the kind of thing that is not uncommon behavior within, because it's a subculture, right? Within a much larger culture, right? So they're a first world industrial nation, and their subculture is now they have this karate explosion into the culture, right? So as it's maturing into the culture, then behaviors are forming around it. And remember, the samurai were a dualist culture. Once the country came under one figurehead and they weren't competing anymore for domination within the country, the samurai would turn to dueling with each other, and they didn't always duel to the death. But they would have formal contracts. They'd make arrangements to have like a formal duel, but very often they would end in death. In dojo storming, I'm not aware of anyone dying from it. You just get somebody to get the shit kicked out of them, right? But it was to demonstrate, here, I'm more worthy than your teacher. You should come and learn from me. Right?
Yeah, which is like in traditional Japan, that would be like a huge slap in the face.
Well, especially for a headmaster. So,
but it's practical.
But wait, when we get to the rivalry, you're gonna sit there and go, So anyway, so the fight between the visitor and the school member, typically the visitor would have to work his way through the multiple students of varying ranks before fighting the instructor, the headmaster, and where the superiority of their respective fighting styles will be put to a test. So this was a way to weed out weaker practices too, like, because if you'd have somebody who had a school and say, for example, that the philosophy, the basic philosophy of the school wasn't robust enough so that it could continue. This was a way to eliminate, I don't want to call them fake dojos, but somebody who might be a headmaster but maybe doesn't deserve to be one, and whatever they're teaching may lack what it needs. So it's a way to distill the better forms of karate, which, and remember, karate is just an umbrella term for that encapsulates all these different fighting systems that are based in karate, but most of them are their own interpretation of a different system of karate, right? And the original systems of karate that came out of Okinawa.
Well, yeah, that makes sense, because everybody's looking for the highest expression of their martial art.
Right, and everybody, and here's the thing, like, everybody talks about Bruce Lee because he was so innovative, and he was, in the way that he approached martial arts and the creation of Jeet Kune Do, which is not so much a style or system, it's an approach to training, to draw out the best elements in the individual as they relate to fighting and combat, right? Well, as you advance in karate or within any martial arts system, and then once you achieve the status of a senior student, so somebody who's earned their title and their rank, you tend to start favoring things that you like to do. And so in essence, what you're doing is you're creating your interpretation of the foundational system that you initially learned that got you your black belt. And then after that, you start playing with it. There's some traditionalists who don't change a damn thing. But for myself, I integrated, like, I was doing like Taekwondo kicks. I integrated with my karate. I integrated Western kickboxing, Filipino stick fighting. Those are elements that I brought into my practice, and even the Wing Chun dummy, which I went out of my way to learn the form, but only because I was fortunate enough to associate with people in those different systems, and so then I got them to transmit some of what they knew to me, and then I integrated it into my training. So my training, my system, my style is truly my style, right? It's a reflection of the things that I like to do. Well, that's universally true for virtually anybody who continues to practice way past their black belt. And I strongly, strongly recommend everybody go out and start kung fu fighting, go and be, find a karate master, right? Again, I've stated it before. I think that that it should be an integral part of the educational system, and we should start training kids like when they're 8. Meditation and martial arts, mandatory, and you can't graduate high school without successfully demonstrating a high capacity in both those things. But that's just me. Anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that would be a great form of PE.
I think so too, and I think for students who are kind of shy and introverted and maybe insecure, it helps them to grow past that stuff. And then for those who are kind of random and chaotic and all over the place, it centers them. The benefits are enormous, and it'd be a disservice to talk about this and not mention the fact that, like, here, everybody could benefit from this. Everybody, because there's some form of martial art that would accommodate, not only be accommodating, but would appeal to any sensibility that for any person out there.
Yeah.
Right? And it's so, ultimately, to me, it doesn't, and this thing, I don't favor particular systems, right? So for me, I'm like, it doesn't matter which form you're studying, you just study, right? And I make the argument all the time, which other martial artists don't like. There are no great martial arts systems. There's only great martial artists. So how great they are has nothing to do with the system that they came from. They would have been great if you put them in another system.
That totally makes sense, because you think about something like Cubism, the abstract art. Somebody could go from that to doing different types of art that would be
hyperrealism.
If the skills translated, then yes. But I think the skills that are practiced in one pursuit falls to the next.
Well, I think it opens doors within the individual that otherwise they might not be able to do. And that this is why it's important. And it would curb things like behaviors like bullying. You'd see a significant reduction in that sort of behavior. But with the advancement of the internet and the way people conduct themselves online through social media, there's nothing to counteract that or counterbalance to that. And I would offer up the idea that maybe meditation and the active pursuit of the martial arts is that very counterbalance to mass information, to mass social media, as a way to offset the negative effects of those things, right?
Yeah, if we're thrown directly into just entertainment like Netflix and 3 screens between us and the wall, there's definitely some negative things that would happen. I think the benefits that you're trying to point out are absolutely right. Like, if you're physically capable to train in martial arts, then you're available to like go through the spiritual aspect of like meditating, being able to process things, being focused, all these like transferable skills that we clearly don't have when we're just fed entertainment.
Right, so they would carry over into everything else that you do. That, again, I don't know if I don't think I could stress that enough, that within the training itself, the repercussions resonate throughout every aspect of your life.
And plus, who's going to want to start a fight when you know there's like 3 assassins in your neighborhood?
Right, or that everybody knows how to everybody's kung fu fighting.
Yeah.
So then how prone would you be to picking a fight going, it could be me against like 3 other martial artists. So and again, movies kind of don't do us a disservice by showing one person fighting off 5 well-trained other martial artists. So you're like, you have to be like superhuman exceptional for that sort of outcome to be real. But that's a fantasy of it. But I digress. I want to get back to like finishing on dojo storming, right? And again, because of how for me, how interesting it was, like that you could offer up challenges and then do live sparring. Now, I want to make one last comment in terms of like sparring stuff before we actually get to the feud and rivalry between uh, Chotobu and Gichin. So anyway, that there's within martial arts now, there's this movement where the idea of full out sparring has way more negative effects than positive benefits, and that the best course of approaching sparring is that one, you should that should be the first thing that you do in the course of showing up in training, and two, that it should be done playfully and lightly. And the point is, because when you're in when if you're sparring and and it is a fight, you're just going to default to the same moves over and over and over again. And the problem is there's no growth in your actual fighting ability. And sparring within the context of a dojo or kwan or a gym, that it gives you an opportunity to work out techniques that you're not comfortable using. And if you're lightly sparring and you're coming at it playfully, we're going to have fun. We're going to because that's what's key. You turn it into this game where we're going to chase each other around and we're going to throw kicks and do stuff that might, like, I'll make a risky move just to see if you can do it without the threat of like you getting your bell rung.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a lot of guys who, as a result of a bad experience in a sparring ring, they just drop their gloves and leave martial arts behind because you got some dick, some ego-driven loser who just ramps it up and then tries to turn it into a guerrilla dance. I'm just going to beat up whoever's in. And go, that's not training. Yeah. Right? There's tons of guys out there who would argue that the only way to do it is to go there and beat the shit out of each other. And I come from in my training, I've experienced that, and I always hated it because it ramped up tension, ramped up anxiety. Where if you come at it the other, which means that you can't learn when you're like that in that state. There's no neuroplasticity, which is just a fancy way of saying learning. But if you want to learn, then you reduce it to play time. You make it fun. And then what you're doing is you're still employing the techniques and stuff. You're not doing them at full speed. You're doing it at like 20% of the speed and force that you can produce. And then what you're doing is chasing each other around. And then this is the opportunity to learn because it's fun. Now your nervous system's totally open to you becoming more engaged and applying things that you might otherwise not do because they're too risky, because you're not comfortable enough with it, you're not familiar enough with the technique. This would be the time where you would actually be able to do it, and because it's risk-free, you don't have to worry about somebody ringing your bell and knocking you out.
Yeah, the thing I really like about it is it's a physical. There's a physical aspect, so you have to incorporate yourself into your actions. Not only that, but it's also like this. It's experimental, but it also has like this abstractness of you can't go with what you traditionally do because they're gonna know what you traditionally do.
Right.
Like it really is playful.
Right. So and hence the importance that playfulness turns it into fun, because now you're having fun, and then as a result of that, now you can integrate techniques into your fighting system or into the way that you fight that you might otherwise not use. Right, because for fear of like for fear that it would create a weakness that your opponent could exploit. And when you're in a ring and you're going after each other, there's nothing good that comes out of that, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Right? There's no, that kind of hostility just doesn't, there's no, it's all it does is foster the worst of the negative things about the combat elements of martial arts. So remember, martial arts in their entirety, they should be practical, functional, they should elevate you spiritually, mentally, provide you with the ability to develop emotional maturity, to raise the spirit of the individual. So if it's only good if it's hitting all those notes, right? So if you're only focusing on one aspect, it's out of balance. It's now a form of extremism.
I can understand what you mean. Like if you get somebody who's not like very understanding of what it's like to get in a practical fight, their first thought is, "Oh, I'm gonna hit them with 100%," and then they break their hand and they're out.
Usually it's people who've got experience who are the dicks. It's not somebody who's like news and experienced. It's these assholes who basically they turn it into like asserting dominance. That
Oh, okay.
right, like they're just ego-driven arseholes who want everybody to go, fear me. It's like shit, man. Like this could be so positive, and you just ruined it. You ruined it for everybody. So those are the guys who the best thing that can happen is they get into a ring with a guy who's better than them, and then they get their bell rung.
Yeah, I think the dynamic there, it's interesting because the person who is more functionally better at the martial art, they would be able to go, "Hey, man, let's just talk it out," and then it's very rewarding to know that the person who's most capable is also saying, "We could work this out in other ways."
Yeah, it doesn't. Any kind of friction doesn't have to be reduced to a physical confrontation. So if there's friction between yourself and somebody else, the best resolution is always to communicate. You can talk your way through it. You'll know if they don't care about communicating. It won't take long for you to figure that out, and then you know where this is going. So then you're left with two options: leave or fight. Right? I would just leave.
It's really unfortunate that, not that you said it, but that it's the stronger people that typically want to fight.
Well, they're not the best fighters.
No, they're picking on the people that they know don't train.
Or that they can dominate, right? Because again, they're inherently bullies that haven't completely worn that out, or they get some kind of borderline psychotic joy out of like doing it to somebody else, right up until it's done to them.
Yeah, it's like high school tactics.
Right. Well, again, that's what I'm saying. So prolonged training, and if it's a complete way of training, then you honor the need for practicality and function, but you also elevate yourself as an individual and in every aspect that you can imagine, right? So those that kind of complete practice creates it does. It helps to create better, well-rounded individuals, right? So anyway. Okay, so now we're going to get to the rivalry between Gichin Funakoshi and Motobu Choki. So they're radically different approaches to study and implementation and practice and application of karate. It's the idea of the way of life versus pure fight focus. And this is where I think the failing is that in a way of life, a portion of it should be a pure fight focus, right? So now we'll get more into that more in depth, but I want to get into the details of the rivalry, right? So when I remember I told you, so after he moves to Tokyo. Gichin Funakoshi has a school in Tokyo, and this is I believe that was in like 1927. And Motobu is curious when he finds another Okinawan teaching a derivative of shurite, as Gichin Funakoshi, and apparently Motobu found the practice. So he went and he was observing what they're doing. The practice too focused on kata rather than fighting. So he also doesn't like Funakoshi's teaching style as an educator, like the way that he instructs his students. So you can imagine that he was probably constantly talking while they were doing kata. So very well could have been very flowery and peaceful kind of language. The idea that like this is really about the elevation of who you are and all that stuff. So you can imagine Motobu is like, is listening to this stuff. And so as the story goes, Motobu told Funakoshi that he didn't what he didn't like about his practice, and he did it in the middle of class. Right? So then Motobu, breaking with the protocol, like that, going through his students, basically crosses hands with a single crossed hand with Gichin Funakoshi, and this is this is kumite, so it's literally grabbing hands, right? And kumite is the part of karate in which a person trains against an adversary, but you're in the guy's personal space. Kumite is just the fighting side of it, but kakeda is when you cross your hands with them, usually at the wrist. And so that means you're in the personal fighting space. So in training, that would be the starting position. So instead of breaking the distance and to have a fight, you start at where the fight begins, right, in each other's personal space. So according to his students, this free sparring, or this kake kumite sparring, Motobu grabs his wrist and then does like a wrist throw, like grabs onto it and throws him to the floor. And Gichin Funakoshi gets up and dusts himself off, and they cross hands again, and he does it a second time, and then he gets up and he does it a third time, and after that, Motobu, actually after the third time throwing him to the floor, just leaves, right? So there's some of his students who said he considered punching him, but he didn't see the point. He clearly made his point, right? So this flowery, peace-loving, all this kind of approach to the martial arts, and he couldn't defend himself. And there's lots of people who speculated that Gichin Funakoshi never crossed hands with anybody, ever. It was probably the first time. And Motobu, with all the experience he had, just basically threw him to the ground.
I thought you were going to describe like an interesting battle and like some repercussions.
Wait, it doesn't end there. Right? So Funakoshi was understandably angry and humiliated, right? So this is where now we're gonna get into more subjectivity and objectivity, but I'm gonna explain some of his behavior. So then after that, because remember, Motobu beat that Western boxer, so he had notoriety. Anytime that his name was mentioned around Gichin Funakoshi, he would become visibly agitated and angry, right? And so what he did was he started a smear campaign where basically referred to Motobu as being illiterate, and yeah, right. And here's the funny thing, does that sound like the behavior of an elevated individual, right? Where it's a public smear campaign, so he's doing interviews and mentioning by name and saying horrible shit to him. And then to compound things further, a couple years, remember, after the fight that Motobu had with the Western boxer, a magazine does a detailed article on what happened, right? And so then them trying to source a picture of Motobu, they end up using a picture, Gichin Funakoshi's picture, to add insult to injury. So Motobu was furious and outraged. But he never acted on it, right? Because of the guy's high status. And Motobu wasn't, even though he was popular, he wasn't was so well ingrained into the hierarchy of like Japan, especially Tokyo, right? So, which Gichin Funakoshi was. He was the favorite son, right? So Motobu was not illiterate. He could read and write Okinawan, but Okinawan Japanese is different from mainland Japanese, right? So he did coin two books on his system of training, but he basically translated them to his students who wrote them down and then made them available to everybody, right? So Funakoshi openly assassinated the character Motobu, calling him illiterate, irreconcilable enemy. Motobu couldn't speak mainstream Japanese. He spoke an Okinawan dialect, and certainly a deficit when trying to teach only Japanese students. And he produced books and he produced books, read and wrote in Okinawan. So to be clear, right? Like he wasn't this just some ruffian or some kind of just street fighter who had nothing going for him. He didn't have the same in terms of personality. He wasn't as endearing as Gichin Funakoshi because he was a poet, right? So he could speak eloquently, whereas Motobu was like brash, and because he was royalty, he never had to explain himself to people, right? He just told people what to do. Well, there's a drawback to that. Like,
it's hilarious because he says, "Oh, I explore the practical applications of martial arts. I don't like your flowery language. I'm going to go in your dojo and show you what practicality means." The guy's like, "Oh, I'm going to react by calling you unforgivable, saying you're stupid, all these different things." It's like that's like a politician. It's not a martial artist.
Right. So now we get into the interesting side of it. So I know you guys were expecting some kind of glorious battle between the two of them, but they were high profile figures. So them being able to get them getting into a fight, and I'll be real frank with you, Gichin Funakoshi was not a fighter. Gigo Funakoshi was a fighter. His son was a fighter, right? But not Gichin. And if there's any truth to the dojo storming story, which this story was recounted by the students who were there, right? And they were like, he basically just had him like that's, and it's why Motobu was gonna like pummel him and stuff, and then he was like, what's the point? Like this guy has zero fighting skills. So they represent two extremes that are incomplete practices as far as I'm concerned. And the reason why their practices were incomplete was because their subjective views of themselves and their practices, right? They were both ultimately self-serving, which kind of and makes Gichin Funakoshi a bit of a hypocrite and a dick too for running the guy's name into the ground. Like,
yeah, that's a huge dick move.
Yeah, it's the kind of shit you go like, wait, so you're gonna slag somebody's personality just so what do you gain from that? Like that you've settled the debt or you've evened the score or whatever affront that they've done to you. Now you get back. It's fucking weaselly. It's the kind of shit that fucking cowards do, right? And yet here he is promoting all these ideas of elevated self. Well, part of being elevated is the ability and the capacity to demonstrate courage and bravery, which is not when you're publicly assassinating someone's character, is not what you're doing. There's no hint of courage or bravery in that.
Yeah, and that's the antithesis of what the other guy believed in, like this idea that it should be practical, it should be applied, not just like us.
Well, we're gonna get to Motobu. Let's just finish deconstructing Gichin Funakoshi first, okay? So his subjective view, like that, he only saw his own self-interest and what it's supposed to be, but he didn't manifest it. He only manifested it in a safe environment when he when he thought there was security, right? And remember, most people who think about this sort of thing think that that Gichin Funakoshi never crossed hands with anyone. He may have when he was younger, like in Okinawa, but not in Japan. And he might have gotten away from fight. He might have kind of distanced himself from fighting and wanting to teach fighting because maybe he had bad experiences from fighting, which inevitably informed this subjective, self-interested view. When the objective view should have been that all the highest elements and aspects of karate that he was supposed to be a master of, he should have put an equal amount of effort into mastering developing his own fighting skills. But he didn't, because and maybe because at 50 he figured he just didn't need to. But I'm going, what, you got challenged by another man who was in his 50s and he had you, right? But that's because you're under the false assumption that somehow that you're safe, and that your assertion that it's only about all goodness. And I'm like, well, it's not. The fact of the matter is life is risky, right? Which, now we'll go to Motobu, Choki. So he, again, self-serving, has stripped away all the stuff that would have elevated him as an individual, made him more sympathetic towards other people, instead of just treating them as opponents. Right? And it's not that these men couldn't demonstrate the capacity to be caring and shit like that, but they also allowed for their ego, their biases, their preferences, their subjective views to dictate their behaviors, when the whole point of all of this stuff is to master that stuff, right? I've said this before, the very name of Sanchin, which is this system of karate, the Weichi-ryu Karate Do that I study, it's the foundational kata. It's not only the foundational kata for Weichi-ryu. There's a number of other systems that it is also the foundational kata. And there's slight variances in the way that they do it, but it's essentially the same codified practice. And it translates as usually three conflicts, but the way it's interpreted is it's interpreted to mean the struggle to unify mind, body, and spirit. And both of these people, they were victims of their own subjectivity.
I'll be honest, I feel like his name's Funakoshi.
Yeah, Gichin Funakoshi.
Well, I feel like Gichin is a little bit further off the mark because he has a poetic understanding, maybe has like the rote understanding of like the methodology. But the fact that he's doing a propaganda campaign, that's like you don't have the aspect of spirituality that you present, and the fact that the guy flipped you 3 times is like a little telling.
Yeah, that maybe that like you've really neglected your abilities, right? And that's your personal space. Like he could have done any number of things, but he allowed for him to grab him by the wrist and then throw him to the floor. Sorry.
Yeah, which I think is like he was either arrogant thinking he could win, or he just gave up and he was like, oh, let him do what he wants.
Or maybe he was just so shocked and caught off guard that he basically froze, right? And why would that happen? Because you neglected the practical and functional aspects of what you're doing.
Yeah, because unless you don't get that tolerance unless you go to a red light district, start some fights, and get hit a couple times.
Well, because you can only imagine, and like I said, Motobu, I liked his approach, but I don't like how brash he was. Because that's kind of like that kind of arrogance. Again, only self-serving. It's the worst of subjectivity. It's ego-driven, and some might argue that he might well be right and feeling that way because the guy was he was a real deal street fighter, and he was doing it for money. And like I said, there's a lot of people who allege that he was betting on himself. So you can imagine then he's got all his money riding on the outcome of the fight. He's gonna fight like a demon, right? Because the stakes for him are way higher than prestige, right? Although, remember, he started out going there to just test what he had learned, to put it to a practical application.
That I find very respectable. Once you start throwing money in, it's like, eh. And then he goes to the guy's place. He doesn't go through the traditional dojo busting. That's
Storming.
yeah, sorry,
It's a great
dojo storming. Like that's disrespectful, and it's not very traditional martial arts. In the idea of like you're supposed to be respectful, you're supposed to like take away the ego.
Well, here was an opportunity for both of them to present in the highest expression of who they are, right? And for their time, that might have even been acceptable, right? Because they couldn't make the distinctions of their subjective view and an objective view of reality, right? And maybe if Motobu was completely objective, maybe he would have never gone down to a red light district to fight, right? So then you wouldn't have this interesting element. And you can only imagine, again, what kind of things went on. So for anybody who's of legal age, the age of majority, to go out to public drinking places and stuff like, can you imagine? You're living in a time where now you have martial artists break out in fights on the street corner and stuff like that in that district, and it's all for money, and and of course avoiding the local law enforcement, all that good stuff, right? I'm really fond of that. I don't know why. I think it would make for really great fiction, but in terms of like the way you conduct yourself day to day, to me, the only reason you ever need to fight is because you are under direct threat, and there's no question of the nature of the threat. It's not. It's not the potential of violence, it's the act of violence. So now you need to act or flee. Those are the only two options, right? And I advocate for the idea that you need to defend yourself. There's going to be moments, but it's only under direct threat, and the threat is real. There's no confusion. You're not responding emotionally. That the intention of the opponent, there's no question of their intention, and then now you're forced to defend yourself. And sometimes, as a result of like the circumstances, you can't flee actually. So
that's the time where it's like you beat them to the ground.
You don't have any other choice. It's either you're going to take the beating or you're going to give one. And I would say it's probably better to give one than to receive one. Right.
Oh, I was gonna mention this because I think it's funny. If Boo, what's his first name?
Gichin
Boo?
Gichin Funakoshi.
No.
Motobu Choki.
Motobu Choki. When he goes into the other guy's dojo and he skips the process of going through the less senior people, I think that shows like a level of egotism.
Sure, because he was offended by the way. Remember, what's caused him to do it was he was put off by the way this guy was teaching.
I would be too. Honestly, I understand his view on that, but you flip the guy 2 times, you're not going to stand there and go, maybe he's a martial artist, like a great martial artist. He's just waiting for the 3rd turn. Like after the first time.
You would think he would have got up and just been throwing kicks and punches, right? Like that, it would have been reduced to okay, it's a fight now. Like because it's clear his intention. He made very clear his intention. He put you in a wrist lock and threw you to the ground. Well, what are you waiting for? Him to stab you with a knife before you'll act in your own defense, right? Again, that's the functional, practical part of that kind of training. The martial arts, that's what it does. It allows for us as individuals to have the capacity to defend yourself against an opponent who wants to cause you harm, right? It's still a very real thing. And the only way that you can deal with a situation like that is you have to prepare in advance for situations like that. So hence the importance and value in training. So yes, the martial arts will contribute to a more robust health. Yes, they can inform your psychology and make you better suited for dealing with physical confrontations. Yes, it'll give you the practical abilities to do that, and yes, that it in terms of the psychology of you as an individual, it'll make you more at ease with the world instead of, at odds with the world, right? Because only subjective, ego-driven, self-serving people who basically are exercising their biases and preferences respond in that way. People who are objective, they don't act in an aggressive way, in a horrible way that would incite somebody to fight.
I feel like depending on what's going on in their mind during that clash they had, it could have been something along the lines of one person thinks the other is, too brash, too, not well.
I think there's just hostility between the two, and I think it started with one person being offended by the other person's preference and bias.
Yeah, they both seem extremely subjective in the idea, like, oh, I'm going to show you my way is right by flipping you 3 times, and the other guy's like, I'm going to show you I'm right by just sitting here and not fighting.
Well, and again, it's the trap of subjectivity. There's not a problem. There's never been a problem in being subjective, right? The problem is when you treat your subjectivity as somehow having greater value than somebody else's. And this clearly demonstrates that, because the two of them were both completely subjective, and they both valued their subjective approach versus the other person, and that can only lead to confrontation. Look, if his successor, his own son, Gigo Funakoshi, immediately integrated sparring, all that, because he recognized that here it's missing an element, it's incomplete, and therefore it'll create people who are incomplete. They're extremists or trapped by their subjectivity, which which actually predisposes them then to being extreme, right? So an extreme pacifist is a victim. An extreme aggressor is also a victim, right? And the only way to resolve any of this stuff is the middle way, and the middle way is balance. And what's that another way of saying? The unity of all those different aspects of what we are as human beings, mind, body, and spirit. So in the unity of that, and then struggling to maintain and achieve that balance, then you're a whole person. Then things like this doesn't happen. Does it mean that you don't get into fights? No. Does it mean you don't throw the first punch? No. It means that you have the capacity then you can be confronted with situations and circumstances like that, and then you're able to act in a way that's appropriate in the most objective way possible, not in the service of self, but what best serves the circumstances and the details of the moments that we're currently having.
I only have like one thought when it comes to these two people that I think I didn't have last time I spoke. Like, fundamentally, I think one of them wanted to pursue the highest point they could get through martial arts, and the other one wanted to find the highest expression of their own spirituality. Like, without knowing what Funakoshi was thinking, I'm not going to say he was a coward. He might have thought something very ideological.
Yeah, he could have been driven by that, but to me, what I see is two people who are driven by ego.
Yeah.
So that immediately means they favored their subjective view, whatever that might have been, right? So regardless of like, you know, if you're promoting peace and love and all that stuff, and sorry, excuse me, I'm just getting over a nasal cold. Peace and coexistence. Um, you can't do it at the expense of being recognizing threats and being able then to like manage the threat, whatever it might be. That's still a requirement. Doesn't matter how peace loving you are. If you're incapable of managing any kind of threats, then all you reduce yourself to is victimhood.
Yeah, being compliant is not peaceful.
No. So you know, so again, I would make the argument only somebody who's strong and has courage and the capacity to be violent can be peaceful, because they can choose that. Where somebody that's their go-to, it's because they're afraid of the alternative. So their hope is that by completely embracing it, it avoids any kind of confrontation that potentially that they might encounter. And I'm sorry to say, like, but life is a risk. It's inherently risky. Everything we do places us in jeopardy. You cross the street, you get hit by a bus or car, like, just, you know, there's no safe havens. So the point then becomes, then objectively speaking, is then to become comfortable being exposed, be comfortable with risk, and then in taking risks, if you're willing to engage with risks, then you can overcome them. And what does that lead to? Confidence, and you know, and it requires you to manifest bravery and courage to those are things that you should favor. You should be trying to nourish that in you yourself. These are qualities that every person can demonstrate, right? But you're not going to get there by hugging your pillow. You're going to get there because you actively get out in the world, you live life, you take chances, you take risks, you expose yourself to potential threats, and then you summon up the strength and courage to deal with them. And here's the thing that I find that throws me off the most. Every time I look at people, all I see are these huge, deep reservoirs of strength that they don't know how to tap into. Everybody demonstrates. I see it in people, and it's because when you're people watching, you can see it manifest. You see a lot of stupidity too, but in terms of like great qualities, I see it in people. These enormous reservoirs of strength. They're bubbling underneath the surface, but they don't know how to turn on the tap. Right? So maybe that should be something to think about. How do you turn on that tap? How do I access that deep potential, those deep reservoirs of strength? How do I gain access to this stuff so that it can make a meaningful contribution to my existence, you as the individual, and then as a result of that, you can contribute to other people's existences in a meaningful way. To me, there's an enormous appeal in that. And if you're asking me, and I'm telling you, if you have the discipline and consistently show up and train in the martial arts and meditation, you will access that stuff. That's how you get to it. All right? Those are just two training methods. There's a whole host of other things, right? But again, we talk at length about like what it is that you can do to manifest those things. So you have to have the intention to do it. You got to have the will, right? You got to start the fire under your own ass. It's not going to come from outside of you. It comes from within you. And you have, again, the capacity to become virtually anything. and yet you choose because we're so well conditioned and subjectivity rules the house that we just favor nothing. You'd rather be nothing, right? Can I get a time check?
Yep. We're past the mark a little bit. We're at 1 hour 20 minutes.
I think I've said enough. Is there anything you'd like to contribute?
I think the last things you were saying definitely hit the right spot. You think about that fire under your ass you need to get. You can visualize what you can be. That's a huge thing to look forward to, and seeing how much we have become consumerists. That's another thing to want to leave, to get away from. So there's something attracting and something deterring you towards your goal.
Right. So again, just remember, you came into this world with almost an unlimited capacity, but it's not a matter of flipping a switch to turn it on. You have to train to draw it out. So you find your method of training, right? And you can do it. You can be anything. Be anything. All right. Having said that, I'd just like to say in closing, question everything, including yourself, especially yourself. Seek balance. Seek knowledge. Seek understanding. Become a renegade, individualist, humanist, critical, objective thinker. Thank you for your time.